Yes, I mean, I think the first thing, the important thing to state is that in terms of development aid, grant development aid, the European Union, both through its multilateral program and through the bilateral contributions of its individual member states, is by far and away the most important player as a donor. And this is a development objective and a foreign policy objective of long-standing, goes right back to the beginnings of the European Union. And the strong commitment of the European Union to development cooperation has been carried forward very much into the modern times, in part through the, if you like, the coordination of global donor efforts, which in shorthand terms is meeting the Millennium Development Goals, if you like. And quite clearly meeting the Millennium Development Goals, which were formulated, as you would expect with a name like that, in 2000 and are due to be met in 2015, requires very substantial policy commitments by the recipient countries and very substantial financial commitments on behalf of the richer nations of the donor community. And they are ambitious goals and they are ambitious targets to meet at the best of times, quite clearly, as we hopefully begin to come out of, but are still in, an economic crisis, a global economic crisis. It is more of a challenge for the donor community to meet its commitments, but there have also been very serious impacts of the global economic crisis on the developing countries, which the MDGs are designed to help. I think it's fair to say that, I mean, this is an interesting year because this is very much a time when we are doing a midterm assessment of where we are with the targets on the Millennium Development Goals. But I mean, quite clearly, a key Millennium Development Goal concerns the issue of access to basic education. And that is an absolute, I think, sine qua non for development. Fairly patchy progress, like many of the goals. You see them met in some countries. You see them even exceeded in some countries to the extent that it's important, as we think of meeting the Millennium Development Goals, also to think about some of the goals we need to set for the post-MDG period, because, as I say, it's very important that there should be not just a target but a pathway to make improvements, to provide the context for policy. I think in terms of access to clean water, we have, I think, very additional challenges because of the impact of global warming, which is not just becoming an issue of access to water, fair access to water, but whether there's going to be enough water to go around. The whole environmental context of development, I think, has become much more challenging. And the issue of access to basic health. I mean, basic health and basic education are so critical to human development. And as we all know, the cost of health, the cost of health provision, the expectations in terms of provision of health care are changing, are becoming more difficult to meet. So there are few of the MDG challenges, I would say, that have become any easier as we look back on the period. Yes, I wouldn't like to talk too much about it, quite simply because we're nowhere near there now. I would like to stress that we need to begin thinking about it now, but we certainly don't want to run the risk of talking about the post-2015 goals before we've even met or come near to meeting the existing ones. I think It's important that we should have our eye to the future. It's important that we should think about the implications, especially for middle-income countries, as they meet or near the point of meeting the existing MDG goals. But we shouldn't take our eye off the absolute essential need to meet the very challenging existing goals. And I say they're very challenging, but if you look at it the perspective of what ordinary people need, they're actually quite modest. Enormous, I think. Enormous for two reasons. One is with the economic crisis, the market for many of the primary goods, which was fueling growth in many sub-Saharan African countries, has been not only reduced, but reduced so suddenly that these countries have not really had an opportunity to adjust properly. But also, many of these countries are very fragile economically, fragile politically, and it is an enormous challenge for them, even when the improved revenues of the past decade were coming in, to actually provide both the financial, material, and human resources required for development. And of course, they are much more challenged now. So the impact is very serious. It's both disruptive, but also, in terms of resources, has been in the wrong direction. Now that means that these goals still stand, but perhaps more imagination, better coordination by the donors amongst themselves and with the countries concerned needs to be addressed very seriously to make sure we don't allow the economic crisis to derail the progress that was being made to the MDGs. Well, I think the European Union has in a sense three major challenges on the coordination front. One is the coordination amongst ourselves. It's not the question you asked, but it is a topic I'd like to briefly mention. Because we are such important donors, both collectively through our multilateral programs and bilaterally through the large programs of many of the major member states, it's very important that in our own work we don't duplicate, we don't compete for projects, we coordinate well. And over the last 15 years, I would say there's been enormous progress made within the European Union of coordinating the way we work amongst ourselves, in setting targets, in being complementary with each other, and in having joint programs when we need to. That's one challenge, and I think we've got real progress there. The other challenge is coordination multilaterally with other major donors, of whom the United States obviously is one, but there are others. This, I think, we're making very good progress with, in the sense that there is a dialogue with the United States. And I think this is a dialogue which is likely to become more fruitful with the new commitments of the new administration, both in terms of the amount of aid, but also a recommitment to Africa, which is very much a priority also for the European Union. But then, of course, the third, wider coordination is not just with other donors. And as I said, we have this coordination with the states. I should also mention with the major IFIs, the World Bank, the IMF and others here. But the final challenge is to make sure our coordination with the countries we are trying to help is properly managed. And that is a huge challenge because with the best will in the world, one has said for years, we must work on the basis that when we program our development cooperation, we coordinate amongst ourselves, but we make sure that the recipient countries are the ones that lead the process. And we have tried to improve the way we ensure that the recipient countries lead the process for years and years and years. I've been in the development game for over 20 years. I still think there's much more that needs to be done. And that's partly, I think, the responsibility of the recipient countries to take much more aggressively their role and their responsibilities in leading the process. There may be disagreements in detail, but I think both the European side and the American side are actually speaking more or less along the same lines, in the sense that development and development cooperation is not just a question of euros and dollars from the donor community. It's not just a question of setting up the, if you like, the delivery structures in the recipient countries. It's also a question of good governance and good policy making by the recipient countries. And in that sense, I think we're all very much speaking as one. When it comes down to detail of what we mean by good governance, or what we mean by criteria that need to be met, or what we mean by some things we will do and some things we won't do, I think there certainly have been some differences in the past. Let me give you an example. On the very important question, for instance, of what one does with respect to HIV/AIDS in Africa. The Europeans have never had the constraints on things like family planning programs that some of our US colleagues have had to, I would say, suffer under, in a sense. And that is as much a domestic issue in the United States as frankly it is a foreign policy one. But I think broadly we're seen as two major donors amongst many others who need to cooperate well and who broadly see the issues in a similar manner. I don't want to get into too many of the more contentious issues on human rights. Are they culturally defined, or are they absolute, or whatever? But I certainly, and I can speak personally as well as the spokesman of the European Union, I certainly believe very strongly that access to clean water, access to basic health, access to basic education are rights as most people would define them. But when you're talking in terms of human rights and good governance, there are also, I think, very good guidelines. There is the Universal Declaration, to which we fully subscribe. The European Union has also some very clear commitments of its own, which it incorporates into foreign policy. We campaign against the death penalty, for instance. That is an issue which is a very European take on human rights, but it's one that we consider to be extremely important. And the whole issue of good governance is partly linked with rights, it's partly linked with commitment to democracy, but it's also linked to effectiveness and efficiency. So I think when you're talking about development cooperation, there has to be a good mixture of pragmatism on many issues and holding fast to certain key values which we as Europeans, and no doubt you as Americans, feel are very important for, in a sense, our own good as well as the good of those with whom we cooperate. The greening of the economy, well, I think there are lessons we can draw very much from each other, I would say. And some of those lessons are clearly drawn fairly quickly. It wasn't long ago that we Europeans were very proud to be able to say that we had the largest installed capacity of wind energy, for instance. Indeed, one member state of the European Union could say that all by itself. That is no longer the case. The United States is now the country that can say we have the largest installed capacity on wind power. But I don't actually think that's a very sensible way of talking about the issue. It's quite clear that the greening of the economy does involve collaboration on research, it does involve investment, and there's a very strong investment flow, by the way, from Europe to the United States into solar energy. But it also involves much better use of the energy we produce. Greening of the economy is not going to be terribly interesting if it just involves bigger, brighter, more chromium-plated solar arrays. It also has to involve much greater efficiency in the way we use energy and much greater efficiency in the way that we limit emissions, which is not just a question of taking emissions out, but it's not making them in the first place. Greening of the economy, to me, is just shorthand for a whole series of, frankly, quite tough political and operational decisions, which all major industrial and industrializing countries have to face and have to make within a very short time if we're going to do something serious about climate change. I think it's very important. Kyoto was, I think, a very important lesson for the global economy, because you had, in the lead up to Kyoto, very strong apparent coherence by all the major powers, including the United States, on the need to reach a far-reaching and ambitious agreement at Kyoto. But then, of course, it failed in the sense that the major partner at the time, in the lead up to Kyoto, the United States, was unable to ratify. Quite clearly, we would not want a similar situation to recur, where we have rebuilt, I think, enormous collaboration, cooperation between certainly the European Union and the United States, and hopefully with the new industrializing powers of China and India, in reaching an agreement at Copenhagen. But if these major parties can get to Copenhagen but fail to implement what is agreed, and that's really, because talk is fine, but what is important is the implementation afterwards. If any of the major parties fail to implement, then quite clearly we will not manage to evade the major effects of climate change. So what do I want to see? I want to see all major players in the pollution game understanding both the seriousness of what they are doing and the importance of them to change.